Hi everyone! So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a PhD student in biology at Harvard University. So I just want to get something straight before we start. What this video is not. This video is not a lecture format like Khan Academy style where I teach you pathology. What it is going to be is me reviewing pathology content and materials for a class that I already took and writing it down in a Notability file for my visual reference. I'm a visual learner, so having a separate file that I can refer to and not just like clunky PowerPoints and stuff is really important. Things you can get out of this: how I study, how I review notes and synthesize content, how I use Notability to do all of these things, and you may learn some pathology along the way. So with that, let's get started. So what exactly is pathology? Pathology is defined as the science of the causes and effects of diseases, and pathos comes from the ancient Greek word for suffering or experience. So you would see a pathologist if you are suspected to have a certain disease and they're trying to figure out what exactly is wrong. For today's video, we're going to be looking at it from a tissue organization point of view. And what that means is if you think about tissue, sometimes you'll think about organ systems like brain tissue or liver tissue, things like that. So what is tissue? It's defined as any of the distinct types of material of which plants and animals are made, consisting of specialized cells and their products. And that is really what you want to think about, is the function that these cells are specialized to do something very specific, and there's an output to it. So for example, if you think about the intestine is made to absorb nutrients. I'm going to try and draw an intestine, it's not going to be good. It is made to absorb nutrients. So if you zoom in to the intestine, what you see are these finger-like projections. And if you actually zoom in even more to those finger-like projections, you see them, but you also see this kind of barrier. So you have the fingers and then this other barrier. So if you eat, you're gonna have not really a piece of chicken floating in there, but don't mind me. And you're going to absorb the nutrition, and the cells that are going to do that are carrying out the function of the intestine, are called parenchymal cells, or the parenchymal area, parenchyma. Whereas the cells below them, they actually carry out the support. So that mitochondria is to give energy to those cells so they can carry out their function or give them nutrients. And so that's called stromal cells or mesenchyma. So now let's try and generalize this a little bit. Parenchyma is not just the intestine, it's all tissue, and parenchyma is involved with function, whereas mesenchyma is involved with supporting the parenchymal cells. And what kind of functions are we talking about with the parenchyma? Metabolism, synthesizing things like your liver does, it metabolizes things for you. Absorbing nutrients, kind of like with the intestine. There's also filtration, excretion, like the kidney. And you also have, for example, structural integrity, which is what the bone is for. And each of those cells, they have their function, but the mesenchyma needs to also support those cells. And how do they do that? First of all, delivering oxygen and nutrients to these cells, getting rid of waste in these cells, making sure that the pH and temperature are maintained, there's structural support for those cells, and also actually checking to see if there's infection or injury in those cells to fight back. So let's think about this in context of us, right? So let's pretend we are a cell and we live in a little house and we need to carry out a function, right? So maybe the function here for us is to cook. And so we live under a roof to keep us safe. And what do we need to cook? Sorry for my bad drawing, by the way. We need something like a stove to cook the food, a fridge to keep the food, to keep it from expiring, and a sink maybe to wash it. But think about it, these electronics actually need support that we don't necessarily see. So for example, the sink will need water and maybe a boiler to keep things good. So let's just draw that real quick. And then, the stove and the fridge will need things like electricity and gas to keep them running. So we really are kind of like parenchymal cells that have a mesenchymal support. So let's delve a little deeper. What type of parenchyma are there? One example is an epithelial cell, epithelium, which is known as the inner skin of the body. And epithelium is a very broad term. Epithelial cells have many functions, which I'll talk about now. I'm going to divide this into functions, a particular characteristic of them, and then types of epithelial there are. So functions: a barrier, absorbing things, excreting things, actually minimal interference to gas exchange, which is kind of complex to think about, but like lungs, and being a distensible container, like your bladder. There are epithelial cells that keep urine from leaving your bladder. And then there's a lot more. That's just kind of like the basics of it. And something that's really important to think about, I'm just going to separate these real quick, is that in order for epithelial cells to carry out these functions, they have a particular characteristic to them, which is that epithelial cells are polarized, which means they have a sense of up and down. So I'll illustrate that to you by thinking about that piece of chicken, right? So you have the intestine, so let's just redraw that really quickly. You have the parenchymal cells, you also have the stroma with its mitochondria, and you have that piece of chicken gets the nutrition into the cells and into the body, right? Little particles of food, yay. But what happens if it were to get out? You wouldn't want that for your food to leave. That defeats the point of the intestine. So this sense of up and down is really important to keep the food in the intestinal area, for example, and keep it in our bodies. So that's why there's kind of this polarized nature of these epithelial cells. So how do they become polarized though? This is a very big topic. I'm just going to copy and paste this to show, but just very generally, you have these junctions between the parenchymal cells known as desmosomes. They are tight junctions, and you also have these connections between the parenchymal cells and the mesenchymal cells, or the stroma, which are known as hemidesmosomes. And just very generally, the desmosomes in the intestine establish a form of up. So they somehow, with these hemidesmosomes, the cells know that this is the upper portion of this organ, and the hemidesmosomes establish down. And also another term in pathology is kind of the division between these two, parenchymal and stroma, known as the basement membrane, which is actually very important for our understanding of cancer, for example. But yeah, the basement membrane divides these two. So now let's talk about types of epithelium, and that has to do with layer number. So you have kind of simple ones where it's just one layer, and they're involved in things like transport, but also they can be a barrier if you have those tight junctions or tight desmosomes. And then there's the second one, which is stratified, which is multiple layers. Let's just draw two. And these ones are definitely more of a barrier, like you'd find in your bladder. And also, in addition to these types of epithelium, there are also different shapes of epithelial cells. So for example, you have these different layer numbers, but they'll have different shapes as well. So if we look at epithelial shapes, you have three different shapes. First of all, you have kind of this flat shape, which you would see in blood vessels, for example, and that's known as squamous epithelium. You also have a cuboidal epithelium, which is just literally a cube. And you also have columnar epithelium, which, has different purposes. So all of these serve different purposes, and that's what's really cool, is that that our tissues have evolved to have these particular shapes depending on the purposes that they serve. So not really going to go too much into all of this later, but it's important to know from a structure-function point of view. Structure and function is the key to biology. So yeah, that's it for now. I'll have my next video up soon, and thanks for watching.